The sky above Brooklyn hung in a sheet of dull gray, the kind of winter morning where the cold seemed to seep through every crack in the pavement. The sharp scent of impending snow lingered in the air, though not a single flake had fallen. The narrow streets were alive with movement, honking taxis, hurried footsteps, and the metallic clang of shop shutters being pulled open. Inside a small corner bakery, Maria Bennett stood behind the counter, brushing flour from her hands onto a well-worn apron. The warm aroma of freshly baked bagels and quants filled the space, mingling with the rich scent of coffee brewing in the corner. It was the kind of day where people moved too fast, too wrapped up in their own lives to notice anything outside their hurried paths. As Maria walked toward the front window to adjust a tray of pastries, her eyes caught something that made her pause. Just outside the bakery's glass door sat a golden retriever. His fur was matted and damp, clinging to his thin frame like a threadbare coat. His large brown eyes didn't beg. They weren't the hopeful eyes of a stray looking for scraps. They held something different: exhaustion, quiet desperation, and a depth that didn't belong to an ordinary street dog. For a moment, Maria felt her heart tighten in her chest, though she couldn't explain why. Strays were common in Brooklyn, especially around shops that discarded leftover food at day's end. But this one was different. He didn't bark, didn't whine, he just sat there silently, watching as if he belonged, as if he had chosen her bakery for a reason. A customer stepped out, nearly tripping over the dog. "Damn mutt," he muttered, sidestepping him without a second look. The dog didn't react. He simply lifted his head slightly, followed the man's movement with his tired eyes, then turned his gaze back to the door, waiting. Maria tried to dismiss the feeling and return to her routine, offering tired smiles to regulars, taking orders, ringing up purchases. But every few minutes, her eyes drifted back to the dog outside, still sitting still, his breath misting the glass. There was something in his patience that made her uneasy. It was as if he wasn't lost, but waiting for her. It wasn't until the morning rush faded near noon that Maria finally stepped outside. Wrapping her arms around herself against the biting wind, she walked up to him. The retriever lifted his head but remained seated, watching. She knelt slowly, her fingers trembling as she reached toward him, unsure if he would bolt or snap. Instead, the dog raised one paw and gently placed it in her hand. Maria's breath caught in her throat. The city noise seemed to disappear, leaving only the sound of her own heartbeat. There was something familiar in the warmth of his paw, in the gentle pressure against her skin. It felt like reaching across years, across memories she couldn't quite name. She didn't understand it, but she knew this wasn't the first time she had held this dog's paw. The door opened behind her. "You're not seriously thinking of bringing that thing inside, are you?" came the voice of Mr. Caldwell, a regular customer who always had something to say. "Strays carry fleas, you know." Maria didn't answer. She tightened her grip on the dog's paw and stood brushing past Caldwell without a word. "Come on, boy," she said quietly, her voice steadier than she felt. "Let's get you warm." The dog hesitated, then slowly stood, legs stiff and wobbly from the cold. He followed her inside. The bell above the door jingled softly as they entered together. Some customers glanced up, curious, disapproving, murmuring among themselves, but Maria didn't care. The dog shook a fine mist of water from his fur and curled up quietly near the radiator, as though this was where he'd always belonged. Maria fetched a small bowl from the back, filled it with water, and placed it beside him. He drank slowly, his eyes never leaving her. There was no frantic gulping, no desperation, just a calm, quiet trust, as if he already knew she would take care of him. Turning back to the counter, Maria caught her reflection in the glass door. Her face looked pale, her brow furrowed with confusion, her heart aching in a way she couldn't explain. There was something about this dog, this golden retriever with worn fur and ancient soulful eyes, that struck her deeply, eyes that felt too familiar, as if he wasn't a stranger at all, as if he had been searching for her, waiting for her, and deep down she realized she had been waiting for him too. As the afternoon wore on, Maria slid the bakery lock into place, her fingers trembling, not from the cold outside, but from something deeper. The warmth of the bakery wrapped around her, but it did little to quiet the swirl of thoughts in her mind. The golden dog lay curled up near the heater, his breathing steady, his body finally at rest. He looked so at home, so comfortable, almost like he'd always known this place, and always known her. The dog lay curled in the corner of the bakery, a quiet presence that didn't go unnoticed. Some customers offered warm smiles, others frowned, and a few whispered just loud enough for Maria to hear. "She's really going to keep that thing in here," one woman muttered as she clutched her bag of scones and shook her head disapprovingly. Maria didn't respond. Her hands moved instinctively through the motions of kneading dough, but her mind was elsewhere, circling back again and again to the golden retriever resting by the heater like he'd always belonged there. Around 4 p.m., the door jingled again and in walked Mrs. Henderson, brushing snow from her coat. A regular for years, she had lived in Brooklyn for more than 5 decades and never changed her order: one cinnamon roll and a black coffee every afternoon. Her gaze immediately fell on the dog, and her face softened into a knowing smile. "Well, who do we have here?" she asked, her voice warm with curiosity and a quiet kindness shaped by a lifetime of witnessing lost souls, both human and animal. Maria stepped out from behind the counter, wiping her hands on her apron. "He just showed up this morning," she said quietly. "Sat outside the door for hours, like he was waiting for something." Mrs. Henderson bent down with a soft groan from her aging knees and offered her hand. The dog sniffed it gently, his cold nose brushing her wrinkled skin. "Sweet boy," she murmured. "Dogs like this, they're never really just lost. They always carry a story with them." Maria felt something catch in her throat. There was a truth in those words that hit too close to home. "I don't know what his story is," she admitted, "but he's here now." Mrs. Henderson straightened slowly, brushing imaginary crumbs from her palms. "You're going to keep him, aren't you?" she asked gently. There was no judgment in her voice, just quiet certainty. "Dogs like him don't come into your life by accident." Maria hesitated. She wasn't the kind of person who brought strays into her life. Everything in her world had been carefully ordered since the divorce: the bakery, her small apartment, the silence she'd learned to live with. But this dog, with his gentle stillness and eyes that seemed to see too much, had already made his way past her defenses. "I don't know yet," she replied, but even she could hear the lie in her own voice. Later that evening, after the last customer had left, and the glow from the streetlights softly lit the front windows, Maria stood by the bakery door, looking down at the dog who had quietly claimed the corner as his own. "Come on," she said gently. "Let's go home." The walk to her apartment was quiet and slow. The only sounds were the distant hum of city traffic and the dog's soft, steady footsteps beside her. He didn't tug at the makeshift leash she'd fashioned from a piece of twine. He didn't chase birds or stop to sniff at lampposts. He simply walked beside her, his pace matching her, as if they'd done this walk together 100 times before. Her building was an old brick walk-up with creaky wooden stairs and radiators that clanged in protest throughout the night. Maria unlocked the door to her small second-floor apartment and stepped inside. The dog hesitated briefly at the threshold, sniffing the air, the subtle scent of vanilla, the faint sweetness of lavender, from the candle burning on the windowsill, then stepped in with quiet confidence, as though he already knew the place. Maria filled a bowl with water and set it on the floor. She rummaged through the fridge and found a leftover roast chicken breast, shredded it, and placed it beside the water bowl. The dog ate slowly and with care, like someone who had known hunger, but had never forgotten his manners. When he was done, he padded across the room and curled up at the foot of the couch, letting out a soft sigh as he settled in. Maria stood watching him for a while, arms wrapped tightly around herself, trying to understand why this dog, this stranger, felt so familiar, so right in her space. The apartment hadn't felt this full, this warm in years. Eventually she gathered a towel and a shallow bowl of warm water and knelt beside him to clean the grime from his fur. He flinched at first, but her touch was gentle, and soon he began to relax beneath her hands. As she reached his neck and parted the matted fur, her fingers froze. There, around the base of his throat, was a thin, nearly healed scar, faint but unmistakable, the kind left by a collar worn too tightly for too long. Her breath hitched. She traced the scar softly, memories rushing back before she could stop them. A backyard in Queens, a hot summer day, her father's angry voice echoing from the porch, a golden retriever puppy who'd grown too fast for the collar no one had bothered to replace. "You belong to someone," she whispered, her voice breaking, "someone who didn't take care of you." At the sound of her voice, the dog lifted his head and looked at her, his eyes locked with hers, filled with a quiet understanding that made her chest ache. For a moment, Maria was no longer a woman standing in her apartment. She was just a little girl again, holding on to the only friend who had ever made her feel safe. She shook her head, trying to dismiss the thought. It couldn't be. Dogs didn't come back after all those years. Not after everything that had happened. But as the dog gently rested his head on her knee and kept his eyes fixed on hers, Maria couldn't shake the feeling that she knew him, not just from today, but from a long time ago, from all the moments that had led her here. "You're not just a stray, are you?" Maria murmured, her voice soft and searching. "You've been looking for something or someone." The dog didn't respond. Of course, but he didn't have to. The truth was already there, in the quiet weight of his head resting on her knee, and in the steady trusting rhythm of his breath. For the first time in years, Maria allowed herself to believe, if only a little, that maybe some things really were meant to find their way back. The apartment was dark, except for the faint amber glow of a street lamp outside the window, casting long shadows across the worn wooden floor. Maria lay on her side in bed, the blanket pulled tight to her chin, but sleep refused to come. From the living room, she could hear the gentle shifting of paws on the floor, and the occasional sigh from the dog now sleeping beside the couch, as if he'd always belonged there. It was both comforting and strange, how easily he had blended into her world, how naturally he had become part of her life, in just a matter of hours. It didn't feel like he was just another lost dog. It felt like he was a missing piece of something she had quietly mourned for a long time. Her thoughts kept circling back to the faint scar on his neck, to the way he had followed her home without hesitation, like he already knew the way. The rational part of her mind reminded her it couldn't be possible. There was no way this dog could be Max, her Max, the golden retriever puppy she had clung to in her childhood. But logic couldn't explain the ache in her chest when she looked into his eyes, or the way her hands trembled as they traced the familiar contours of his fur, as though her fingers remembered what her heart had tried to forget. The memories long sealed away started to leak through, sharp, vivid, undeniable. The scent of summer rain on hot pavement, the sound of her father's angry voice echoing through the narrow hallway of their old home in Queens, and always Max, pressing his warm body against her side, his presence shielding her from the chaos, offering silent comfort through every slammed door and shouted word. He had been her protector, her refuge, her only source of peace, until the day he was taken away. Maria squeezed her eyes shut and forced herself to focus on the present, the gentle hum of the radiator, the distant hum of city traffic, the soft rise and fall of the dog's breathing. But the past wasn't done with her yet. She didn't remember falling asleep. She only knew that when she awoke, the sky was still dark, and dawn was just beginning to wash the edges of night into gray. Sitting up slowly, the blanket slipping from her shoulders, she saw him, Max or Lucky, or whatever name he'd carried through all those missing years, sitting by the window, head slightly tilted, eyes fixed on the empty street outside. He didn't move as she entered the room, her bare feet silent against the cold floor. He just sat there, perfectly still, as if waiting for something or someone. "What are you looking for?" she whispered, the words barely audible. The dog's ears twitched at her voice, but he didn't turn. The silence between them felt thick, not uncomfortable, but full of everything they couldn't say. Maria knelt beside him, resting her hand gently on his back, and felt the slow, steady rhythm of his breath under her palm. Images came faster now, rushing in like waves. A small park near their old house, the patch of grass, where she used to sit with Max, while the other children played nearby. The nights she snuck him into bed, after her father had passed out, and that last awful day, standing in the doorway, helpless, as her father dragged Max down the porch steps, the dog's paws scrambling against the slick wood. "He's just a dog," her father had said, his voice cold and final, as if that were supposed to make it hurt less. But it hadn't. She had never cried so hard, not even after the divorce, not even after leaving Queens and cutting ties with nearly everyone she knew. That day had left a scar she had carried ever since. Losing Max had been her first real lesson in how love could be ripped away without warning. And now here he was, or at least something so close, so achingly familiar, it made her chest tighten. The next morning, Maria picked up the phone and called the bakery. She told her assistant manager she wouldn't be coming in. It was rare for her to take a day off, but something about this moment felt important. Whatever had brought this dog into her life, it wasn't done yet. She clipped the makeshift leash back onto his collar, pulled on her coat, and stepped out into the cold Brooklyn morning. She didn't know where she was going, but she let her feet move anyway. Max led the way, his pace sure and steady, his nose lifting into the air like he was following a scent only he could detect. They walked for blocks, then crossed neighborhoods. It wasn't until they reached Queens that Maria realized where they were heading. Her old neighborhood had changed, new shops, unfamiliar buildings, but the bones of it were still the same. The cracked sidewalks, The narrow, brick-lined streets. The little corner deli with the faded green awning. It felt like stepping into a memory, thick with nostalgia and regret. They stopped in front of a small park. The grass was patchy, brown, and brittle from the cold. But the old wooden bench was still there, right where it had always been. Max sat beside it, his tail sweeping slowly across the frozen ground, and Maria felt the world shift beneath her. "This is where we used to come," she said quietly, more to herself than to him. Every time things got bad at home, she sat down, the cold from the bench seeping into her bones as memories washed over her in waves, and beside her Max sat silently, like he'd never left. Maria sat quietly on the bench, her breath forming faint clouds in the cold morning air. Max leaned against her leg, his warmth seeping through the fabric of her jeans, grounding her in the moment. They sat in stillness, watching the world pass by, and for the first time in years, Maria felt something close to whole. As if summoned by fate, an elderly woman shuffled past them, a plastic shopping bag swaying at her side. She slowed, eyes narrowing slightly, as they landed on Max. "I know that dog," she said, her voice raspy with age, but clear. Maria turned, startled. "You do?" The woman nodded. "Used to see him around here. He showed up not long after that old man with the cane moved away. The dog would sit right here on this bench, just like he's doing now, always looked like he was waiting for someone." Maria's heart skipped. "How long ago was that?" she asked. The woman shrugged. "Years. I always wondered who he was waiting for." Looking down at Max, Maria gently threaded her fingers through his fur. He was staring up at her with those same calm, knowing eyes, the same patient gaze that had made her stop on that cold Brooklyn sidewalk. And suddenly the truth came over her. He hadn't just been waiting, he had been waiting for her. The realization was too large to fully grasp all at once, so she let it settle in slowly, piece by piece. The scar on his neck, the way he had walked beside her like he knew the path, the deep understanding in his eyes. She didn't know how, or why, or even if it could truly be him, but the truth was undeniable, leaning quietly against her leg. "You found me," she whispered. Max wagged his tail once, as if to say, "I never stopped looking." The morning air in Queens felt sharper than in Brooklyn, filled with the scent of exhaust, damp earth, and something older, something familiar. Every step they took peeled back a layer of her past, revealing memories she thought had been buried long ago. Max moved with purpose, his pace steady and confident, like he wasn't just walking for the sake of walking. He was leading her somewhere. Maria watched him closely, the way his tail swayed, how his ears flicked at the noise of passing cars, never distracted, never deterred. "You've been here before, haven't you?" she murmured. He didn't respond, but the way his shoulders stayed firm, the way he kept moving forward, told her everything. As they continued, the cityscape began to change. The buildings looked older now, their bricks weathered by time and indifference. She passed the old corner bodega, where she'd once spent her allowance on candy, and the rusted chain-link fence that still enclosed the vacant lot where she'd played hopscotch with children, whose names she could no longer recall. Everything was smaller than she remembered, yet heavier somehow, as if the air itself carried the weight of her childhood. They turned one final corner, and there it was, the park. Small and simple, a worn patch of grass, a cracked concrete path, and a few old benches. But to Maria, it was a time capsule. This was where she had come to escape, her sanctuary from a home that had often been too loud, too tense, too much, and Max had always been with her. Her steps slowed, her throat tightening as the past overlapped with the present. In her mind's eye, she was 9 years old again, sitting cross-legged on the grass, with a golden retriever puppy, who barely fit in her lap, but refused to leave it. She could almost hear her own laughter, carried on the wind, distant and precious. Max continued forward, slowing only as they reached a familiar wooden bench near the edge of the park. Without hesitation, he sat beside it, his tail curling neatly around his paws, as he stared at the tree beside the bench. Maria swallowed hard. It was too specific, too perfect. This was their bench, the one they always returned to, whether they'd been playing, or simply seeking quiet after one of her father's outbursts. She sat down slowly, the cold wood pressing against her palms, and Max leaned against her leg like no time had passed at all. "You really remember, don't you?" she whispered. The wind stirred around them, rustling the brittle leaves, scattered across the path. Then from behind, the soft sound of footsteps broke the quiet. Another elderly woman in a worn gray coat approached, her plastic shopping bag swinging as she walked. Her eyes swept over Maria, then paused on Max. Her brow furrowed with recognition, and she studied him as if trying to recall a face she hadn't seen in years. "I know that dog," she said again, her voice softer this time, but certain. Maria's breath caught. "You do." The woman stepped closer, squinting slightly. "He used to come here, sat right by that bench, day after day. I always figured he was waiting for someone." The words settled heavily on Maria. "How long ago was this?" she asked quietly. "Years," the woman said, twisting the handles of her bag. "One day he just showed up, no collar, wouldn't let anyone get too close, but he never really left either. Like he had unfinished business." Maria reached down and placed her hand on Max's back, her fingers curling into his fur. "And you never found out who he was waiting for?" The woman shook her head. "I always wondered, figured they must have meant the world to him." The weight of it all pressed down on Maria, leaving her breathless. It felt too impossible to believe, too overwhelming, yet here they were, sitting on the same bench, in the same park, bound by the same unspoken understanding that had once been the foundation of her entire childhood. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The elderly woman smiled gently before continuing on her way, leaving Maria alone with the dog, who against all odds, had found his way back to her. Max didn't need words. He never had. He leaned into her side, his warmth chasing away the cold, and Maria rested her hand on his head, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breath. "Did you wait here for me all those years?" she asked quietly, not expecting an answer, but Max gave her one anyway. He lifted his paw, gently placing it over her hand, just like he had that first morning in front of the bakery. It was the only answer she needed. Tears stung at the corners of her eyes, but Maria didn't wipe them away. She let them fall, soaking into the fabric of her jeans, mingling with the dirt beneath her shoes, a tiny offering to the place that had been their home, long before she ever understood what home really meant. She didn't know how or why it had happened, how a lost dog had crossed time and distance to find her again. But some things didn't need explanations. Some things were just meant to be, and so they sat side by side, in the place where it had all begun. Maria closed her eyes, her hand resting on the dog, who had been her past, her protector, and her second chance. For the first time in years, she felt whole. The cold morning air, outside the Hope Haven animal shelter, bit into Maria's skin, but she barely noticed it. Max walked beside her, his head level with her hand, his steps perfectly in sync with hers. There was no leash between them, but there didn't need to be. Wherever she went, he would follow. That much was clear now. The shelter was smaller than Maria had imagined, a squat brick building, nestled between an auto repair shop and a shuttered laundromat, its peeling sign barely visible above the door. Inside, the air was thick, with the scent of disinfectant and damp fur, the echo of barking dogs, bouncing off the tiled walls. It wasn't a sad place, exactly, but there was a weight to it, a heaviness that came from housing too many stories that had ended before they had a chance to begin again. A woman appeared from behind the counter, her short silver hair tucked behind her ears, and a pair of smudged glasses perched low on her nose. Her name tag read Ellen Parker, and her smile was warm but weary, the kind of smile worn by someone who had long since accepted they couldn't save them all, but kept trying anyway. "Can I help you?" she asked, her gaze falling immediately to Max. For a split second, her expression froze, recognition flickering behind her eyes. A sharp inhale betrayed her surprise. She stepped closer, crouching slightly to get a better look at him. "Lucky," she said softly, disbelief lacing her voice. Maria's brow furrowed. "You know him?" Ellen straightened, still staring at Max, as if she were seeing a ghost. "We called him Lucky, when he was here. He showed up a few years ago, no tags, no chip, just this old collar that looked like it had been through hell. He wouldn't let anyone near him at first. Just sat by the gate like he was waiting for someone. Even after we brought him inside, he never really settled, always watching the door, like someone was going to walk through at any second." Maria's hand rested gently on Max's back, as she processed Ellen's words. "Why Lucky?" she asked softly. "Because we found him after a snowstorm," Ellen replied, half-starved, filthy, but still standing. "We figured any dog who could survive, that was either lucky or stubborn as hell." Ellen smiled faintly, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "He had this scar on his neck, like a collar had been too tight for too long. We tried to find his owner, but no one ever came forward. Honestly, she trailed off, glancing between Maria and Max, hesitation in her expression. What? Maria pressed. He never wanted anyone here. Ellen continued. We had families come in all the time, good people, people who would have given him a great home, but he wouldn't connect with anyone. He was polite, gentle, but distant, like his heart was somewhere else. Maria swallowed hard. He was waiting for me, she said softly, the weight of it pressing down on her chest. Ellen's smile softened, turning into something more knowing. Yeah, I think maybe he was. Without another word, Ellen disappeared into the back room, returning a moment later, with a small plastic bag. Inside was a weathered leather collar, its buckle rusted, and the edges frayed with age. Dangling from it was a silver tag, scratched and dulled, but still legible. Maria took it with trembling fingers, brushing her thumb across the worn surface, until the letters caught the light. Her knees nearly buckled. She sank onto the bench near the entrance, the collar clutched tightly in her hands. The room blurred, tears pricking at the corners of her eyes, her chest burning with something too big to name. Max, her Max had been out there all along. Through snow and rain, through shelters and streets, through all the years she thought she had lost him forever. He had been waiting, surviving, fighting, and now, somehow impossibly, they were here together. Max sat at her feet, his head resting against her knee, his golden fur warm beneath her trembling hands. Ellen stood quietly nearby, giving them the space they needed. Maria sat on the worn wooden bench, her fingers curled tightly around the small weathered collar that had once claimed Max as his own. It felt impossibly small in her hand, like a relic from a life they had both been forced to leave behind. Yet, despite its size, the weight of the collar felt immense, as if it carried every step of the journey they had taken together, every twist of fate that had led them back to this moment. She leaned down, pressing her forehead gently against Max's fur, the warmth of him grounding her, the familiar scent of his coat bringing a sense of peace she hadn't felt in years. You found me, she whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of disbelief and wonder. After all this time, you found me. Max's tail thumped softly against the floor, the only answer he needed to give. For a moment, Maria didn't move, allowing herself to bask in the quiet comfort of his presence. It had been so long, so many years of wondering, of searching, of thinking she had lost him forever. And yet, here they were, together again. She had never expected this. She had thought that chapter of her life had closed long ago. But now, it felt like a miracle, like something bigger than both of them had conspired to bring them back together. With a soft laugh that broke somewhere between disbelief and wonder, Maria wiped her eyes with the back of her sleeve. She had never imagined this moment. She hadn't known what to expect, but this was something she couldn't have predicted. I want to keep him, Maria said quietly, her voice steadier now, though it was still laced with emotion. Officially, I mean. Ellen, who had been standing nearby watching them, smiled knowingly. I figured, let's get the paperwork started, she said gently, as if she had been waiting for this moment herself. Maria filled out the forms, her signature looping neatly across the bottom of each page. Her pen trembled just slightly in her hand, the weight of the moment sinking in with every word she wrote. With each line, it felt more real, not just the adoption, but everything that had come before it, the years of uncertainty, the silent years of searching, the impossible reunion. When it was done, Ellen handed her a folder with Max's records, vaccinations, intake papers, notes from the volunteers who had cared for him, even a small envelope, labeled simply found with collar. Maria slipped it into her bag, without opening it, unwilling to disturb it yet. There was something about that envelope that felt too sacred, too intimate to open just now. As they stepped outside, Maria noticed that the air had become warmer, and the sun had finally managed to break through the heavy clouds, washing the sidewalk in a soft golden light. It was as if the world itself was acknowledging the change, welcoming them back in a way. Max walked beside her, his head held high, his stride confident and sure, as though a weight had been lifted from both their shoulders. She looked down at him, and smiled. Come on, Max, let's go home. He didn't need to be told twice. With each step they took, they left the past further behind them, yet the past no longer felt like a burden. It felt like proof that some bonds were unbreakable, that some promises were never truly forgotten, and that some hearts always found their way back home, no matter how long it took. The subway ride back to Brooklyn stretched endlessly, each second feeling like an eternity. Maria sat quietly, Max at her feet, his warm presence comforting her more than words ever could. Her hand rested gently on his back, feeling the rise and fall of his breath beneath her fingertips. She could still hardly believe he was there, by her side, after all these years. In her bag, the old leather collar, and the worn silver tag, felt heavier than they should, the weight of lost years, pressing down on her every time her fingers brushed against the cracked leather. Memories flickered through her mind, days spent in a sunlit backyard in Queens, a little girl laughing, a golden retriever chasing a red rubber ball. She could almost hear the laughter again, carried on the breeze, as vivid as if it had happened only yesterday. By the time they reached her apartment, the sky had darkened, the lights of the city casting long shadows along the streets. Max walked beside her, steady and loyal, his presence a silent comfort. It was as though the years apart had never happened, as if they had always been together. That quiet, unwavering trust Max had in her was something Maria would never take for granted again. It comforted her in ways she hadn't known she needed, and yet, at the same time, it broke her heart. The love between them was so simple, so pure, and yet it had been fractured by time, distance and circumstance, and yet here they were, reunited, as if no time had passed. Inside, Maria sat down on the couch, reaching into her bag to retrieve the envelope Ellen had given her. The letter inside was nearly a decade old, signed by a man named Frank Howard. His words were simple, but the weight they carried was immense. To whoever finds him, his name is Max. I don't know where he came from, but I know he belonged to someone once, someone who loved him. I see it in the way he watches the door, waiting for someone who never comes. I've cared for him as best I can, but I'm an old man, and my time's running out. Please, if you find this, don't let him lose hope. He's waiting for someone. I think he's been waiting a long time. Maria read the letter twice, then again. The words seemed to sink deeper each time. She could picture Frank, this lonely old man, living with a dog, whose heart belonged to someone else, a heart that had never truly been his. The same quiet sadness she had seen in Max, that first morning outside the bakery. The letter listed an address. The next morning, Maria and Max took a cab to Queens, the weight of the letter pressing heavily on Maria's chest. The house was smaller than she had imagined, a sagging porch and peeling paint. But the second they arrived, Max's ears perked up, his gaze sharpening, as if he knew exactly where they were. The man who answered the door was older, his face softening when Maria asked about Frank. Frank passed a few years back, the man said. Good man, kept to himself, except for that golden retriever. Sat on the porch all day, watching the street. Frank always said he was waiting for someone. The man looked down at Max. Looks like he found her. Maria's throat tightened, but she managed a soft, heartfelt thank you. Before walking away, Max closed by her side. She felt the weight of everything, the years of waiting, the kindness from strangers, and something much larger than either of them, that had brought Max back to her. That night, Maria placed the collar, the letter, and an old photograph on her coffee table, a snapshot of a little girl and her golden retriever, a red ball between his paws, the past and present finally aligned side by side. Max lay at her feet, his breathing soft and steady, as though nothing had ever changed. Maria sat beside him, her hand resting gently in his fur. We found each other, she whispered. Somehow we found our way back. Max's tail thumped once, a soft but sure reply. Some stories don't need logic, some stories only need love.